All right, welcome to your PowerPoint on relationship formation and intimacy. Enjoy this one. It's kind of our last fun PowerPoint before we get into some tough topics like infidelity and intimate partner violence and substance use issues. Okay, so the Ghanaian reading is a great chapter summarizing the key factors of mate selection. And we'll be talking about some of this in lecture as well. So you might be thinking, which of these surprised you, which of them didn't. And they report that there's really just a small amount of research on gay and lesbian couples. So this is more heteronormative, heterosexual focused. So kind of put your thinking cap on and think, do these same factors still apply? Okay, so for the readings on intimacy, you have a choice between two. The Armstrong reading is only focused on heterosexual individuals, and the Kampfler reading is focused both on heterosexual and queer individuals in a comparison of hookup culture. So Armstrong and her colleagues assert that there's a sexual double standard that leads to the orgasm gap in heterosexual hookups, more so than in heterosexual relationships, and that the way to change this is for men to be more generous in providing sexual pleasure in these hookups and women to be more entitled to receive sexual pleasure. She can weigh in on that. And then Kampfler really makes the case that heterosexual hookup culture is dictated by these three things: meaninglessness, ambiguity, and alcohol, and that queer hookup culture does not follow this pattern. And I think he tries to draw a really clear distinction, so you can weigh in on how much you agree or disagree with it. Okay, so here's the topics we'll be covering: mate selection, attachment formation, online dating, attachment and sexuality, casual sex, and pornography. All right, let's get started with factors influencing mate selection. Okay, so when we think about what influences us to pick someone, the number one factor is proximity, also called propinquity, which is just having contact with the person, which makes sense. Like, you can't pick someone unless you kind of, have some proximity to them. Even a decade ago, we were talking more about social being the number one factor. And this can be, for example, meeting someone through your friends or your family. Like, I've got somebody I think you should meet. That's how I met my husband in the 90s, is my best friend Marianne said, "Have you met Jordan? He's such a nice guy. I think you should meet him," right? Okay, so that used to be the number one way, but now it's been usurped by, cyber proximity, basically online platforms for meeting someone. So in the last maybe 10 years, that's become more prominent, definitely for heterosexual couples, and I think it's been even more prominent for gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender couples. And then the third one there is just physical. That means you're working with them. You have a class together, right? You go to the same gym or kind of, the same clubs or those kinds of things, or you meet them out at a bar or something like that. That would be the physical proximity. So you can be thinking about kind of what have been your factors so far. Okay, so the next big factor influencing mate selection is called homogamy or endogamy, which means similarity. And we may often wonder, is it opposites attract or birds of a feather flock together? And the research evidence, at least for the big demographic factors, is more on the evidence for similarity. So we are more likely than not to pick someone, and we've touched on this a little bit when we talked about interracial couples, but we're more likely than not to pick someone who is of a similar age, a similar racial or ethnic background, education level, income level, political and religious attitudes, especially if that's important to us. We're going to pick someone who's more similar to us. Similar degree of physical attractiveness, which is always surprising, but has been well documented, in the research literature. And you may notice that sometimes if you meet a couple where one seems to be a lot more attractive than the other, you're like, that seems unusual. And then maybe other, personal traits that kind of matter to someone. So if you want someone if you're really funny and you want someone who's funny, or you love, going out to music, you want someone who wants to do that with you. So other things of value, we might pick people who are similar. And there is this interesting process where as we progress in relationship seriousness, we get more homogamous. It's called the winnowing process. And so basically dating couples are the most heterogeneous, like the most different. And then if you move to cohabitation, those couples on average are a little more similar. And then the couples who marry are even more similar. And so you can think of this like, for example, I dated guys who were really interesting, but I never would have married because they were too different from me. We should also note that even though we make these arguments about homogamy or similarity, that like we've talked about already, gay and lesbian couples tend to be more heterogeneous. They allow more difference in these demographic factors, whether that's because their dating pool is smaller or because they've deconstructed difference and have maybe a higher tolerance for diversity. It could be either or both of those factors. Okay, there's so much interesting information on this slide, so you can be thinking about what is most interesting to you. So obviously not everybody that we have proximity to and similarity with do we find attractive. So there's got to be this something else, right? And so what comprises that? Researchers suggest that there's a few different things. First is this familiarity, having repeated interactions with someone. So maybe initially you weren't like that into them, but after kind of talking to them a little bit more, seeing them a bit more, they start to get more attractive to you. I noticed that, for example, I find my friends more attractive, the longer we're friends together, At the same time, there's kind of a balance there. People don't want too much familiarity. So we tend to have less sexual and romantic interest in our childhood peers, although certainly it does happen. Many of you may be in kind of relationships that started early in your lives. The second one is affect or emotion. So if people are in higher states of affective arousal, like higher states of fear, sexual arousal, or happiness, they are more likely to rate people as attractive. And psych researchers do this in laboratory studies where they basically induce the mood, one of those moods, by having people watch something, and then afterwards they kind of have them come across maybe a research confederate that they rate in terms of attractiveness, and they compare that with people who, watched something more neutral. So this is just good to keep in mind because, sometimes you might be just kind of all excited and having a great time and somebody seems really appealing then, but maybe not so appealing, in the normal light of day, later. So worth keeping that in mind. And that ties to some of what we learned about under stress. We release oxytocin that helps us bond with people. And so and during those fear kind of situations, we're more primed to perhaps bond, and maybe that's related to attractiveness too. Some aspects of people's facial features. So having a more symmetrical face, meaning that your eyes on both sides kind of line up and your ears are the same size and everything kind of matches up more. Having a more average face, and that doesn't mean average in terms of attractiveness, but it means like an average size nose, an average size mouth, average spacing between your eyes, average size head, those kinds of things. And then having what are considered more sexually mature features, like stronger jaws for men or plumper lips, for example, for women. And I will say that this is all kind of more older and established research. So, and a lot of this research, when I looked at it, they weren't even reporting or measuring sexual orientation. So I think they were presuming heterosexuality. So it'd be interesting to see if there's more recent studies on this, or maybe there will become. Some of this is influenced by ovulation. So when they are ovulating, females prefer, and this is again a presumption of heterosexuality, prefer more masculine faces and deeper voices. And men tend to rate ovulating women as more attractive. We're going to revisit this when it comes to infidelity because there's some risks there when females are ovulating. Okay, olfactory cues is particularly fascinating. This is how someone smells, and this could be pheromones or just kind of as you get up close to them, how they smell. And this seems to be associated with gene compatibility, that if someone smells good to you, maybe you're going to make better babies together. Again, a kind of heterosexist assumption there. And olfactory cues seem to be stronger when females are ovulating. They pick up on kind of who's a good fit, maybe better when they're ovulating. So good to keep that in mind too. I don't know if you've ever had the experience I did where someone I thought was just a great fit for me and I found them attractive. But then I got close enough to smell them and I was like, nope, that's not it. So yeah. And then the last one is transference. So Helen Fisher calls this your love map that you create that's influenced by previous family and romantic relationships. So for example, family, like I grew up with lots of people with brown eyes and brown hair. So that's always like safe for me. That always feels safe for me. But based on like my early romantic crushes, I was always attracted to guys with strawberry blonde eyelashes or flip-flops and slightly bow legs. It's still why to this day I find men in flip-flops attractive because I've built some sort of love map that I'm transferring, down the road. Okay, so what's next? Because as we all know, sometimes who we are attracted to isn't the right fit for us. So in general, people tend to agree that personality-wise, they're looking for someone who's trustworthy, kind, caring. Social status is generally always perceived as attractive. Having education, kind of financial stability, maybe being well liked, friends, that kind of thing. They obviously have to reciprocate your interest or else it's not going to go anywhere. It's better, people who are appearing to be selective are perceived as more attractive. So that makes sense, right? When people are desperate, it just doesn't look very good. It's not very attractive or appealing. So even if you do feel desperate, you want to hide it and look like you're being selective. And then the last one is infatuation, that process has to kick in, basically. And so we're going to be talking more about what that looks like in a few slides. Okay, so just pause and think about kind of what was the biggest factor influencing your most recent mate or crush? And so was it your proximity, just kind of running into them? Was it a similarity of their values, to you or backgrounds? Was it about that kind of mysterious chemistry? Was it about personality factors? They seemed kind. Or was it something about transference? They remind you of something that feels either safe or that you've found attractive in the past. So generally, men and women are becoming increasingly similar in what they're looking for in a mate. And this is around the world, but especially in more egalitarian cultures. So everyone seems to like people who they have, who are trustworthy, who are kind, warm, empathic, who have decent social status and who they have an attraction to. It didn't used to be this way. We used to see more gender differences, but now in more recent years, it's more gender similarity. This research has been going on for decades. David Buss has led a lot of it. And I'm not sure if they even ask about sexual orientation, but the way they tend to report it in both research studies and in the media is often presuming heterosexuality. So sometimes what you hear in the media is, for example, men are looking for a woman who's attractive and women are looking for a man with good financial prospects. And you used to see more of that finding, but as you can see from this, there's a slight difference there, but really that's not the main story that this data is telling us. Okay, so what does infatuation look like? Well, first we just start thinking about this person a lot more in a positive way, and sometimes we are thinking about them so much that we're distracted, right? And you've maybe been with friends who are in that situation. You're trying to have a conversation about someone else, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, I just can't stop thinking about, so and so." We also know that the reward system of the brain is more activated, and dopamine is being released from anticipating seeing the person, from the attractiveness of their face, also just from heightened attention and arousal. But at the same time, there's also heightened activity in our brains associated with anxiety. Our sympathetic nervous system is more fired up, and you can maybe remember that. Sweating, trembling, difficulty eating, hard time sleeping, pounding heart. The first time that my husband and I kissed, we were shaking so badly it was embarrassing, right? That's the anxiety part of our nervous systems. And then jealousy and mate guarding. Mate guarding is when you warn your friends off, like back off, he or she is mine. And I always joke that mate guarding is actually how I got my husband to like make his first move, because I was really kind of interested in him, but he was playing it real cool. And it wasn't until his roommate said, "Hey, if you're not going to ask Ashley out, I'm going to ask her out," that he was like spurred into action, right? So mate guarding is also a sign of infatuation beginning. All right, so let's talk more about what's happening in our brains and bodies when we're falling in love. And research on this, I would say, is in its earlier stages, at least in humans. There's been more research done on other mammals. And overall, I will tell you that the research seems to be about gender similarity rather than gender difference, although you'll occasionally see people trying to make the case for gender difference. But in our review, we're mainly seeing a story of similarity. So we already talked about dopamine. So let's talk about endogenous opioids. So this are the opiates that our bodies create, not ones that we are taking in. And they're released, around sex and contact or comfort, euphoria, well-being. They're also released during exercise, and they decrease our perceptions of pain and stress. And Bex and Cohn kind of theorized that basically an opioid addiction is parallel to falling in love, right? That same kind of euphoria that you can get from both. But then you can habituate to that and then experience withdrawal symptoms, either when actually giving up your drug or when your relationship or kind of crush or whatever ends. Oxytocin, which we've touched on, is released by social bonding, orgasms, falling in love, touch, our stress and fear systems. And so that makes sense that that would be happening. Cortisol, we are more likely to release cortisol, increasing at times of separation and maybe decreasing at reunion. But when we think about that anxious, nervous, the anxiety, more anxiety in our brains, we might imagine that we've got just maybe some more cortisol and stress even being with, our new potential prospects. And then the vasopressin research is really more, as last I remember, like on prairie voles, but it is suggesting that it could be a neurochemical or, a biological, I'm not sure, if vasopressin is a hormone. Anyway, a chemical in our bodies that is also associated with kind of inner male aggression, but also kind of pair bonding too. All right, let's switch from mate selection to talking about a closely related topic, which is attachment formation. Okay, so this material is based on the Zayas reading that you did in the attachment module, and we're going to go into each of these three stages on the next slides. Okay, so in the very first phase of attachment formation or pre-attachment, you're basically creating a mental representation. It's almost as like Piaget's schemes, right? You're creating a little file folder in your head where you're building kind of a database about this person. You're kind of gathering information and sticking it in there. You're also in this place where you're more kind of playful, exploratory, you're flirting, it's more uncommitted involvement. And if this is going well, then infatuation is going to kick in, which we've talked about, increased dopamine and anxiety. Okay, so in this second phase of attachment formation, which is called attachment in the making, we are really solidifying our mental representation of that person, and we are deepening the quantity and quality of time that we spend with them. And this, I think, is so interesting. It's such a hallmark of relationship formation across the decades, even if our mediums have changed, so maybe we used to write love letters and now we're using our phones to kind of deepen our connections. But that when we think about that quantity of time, right, we are just kind of spending more time together, and that keeps kind of activating and expanding our mental representation. And with that quality, this is where we start to self-disclose more personal sharing, more sexual intimacy. And we also tend to do more trust. And we also tend to do, at this stage, we tend to do more fun and novel things. Like we take a spontaneous road trip, we bake cookies together, we hike, we go to see the sunset or the sunrise. once we get established, we stop doing a lot of those fun and novel things. And those types of things also activate the reward system and build a sense of intimacy. So that's one reason why I think marital counselors oftentimes are with older couples who are more established, maybe getting a little bit bored with one another. They're often encouraging, kind of, here, ask some new questions, do some new kind of fun, novel things, right, to kind of get the dopamine going, activate the reward system, and build some connection. And then we also are beginning to do that distress relief dynamic and have more developed kind of this person as a sense of safe haven, which is just going to deepen our attachment bond with them. And if we're not already, we're probably moving towards exclusivity, unless that's not, our goal in life. All right, the third and fourth stages of attachment formation are combined for adults: clear-cut attachment and goal-corrected partnership. And I'm not sure what the term goal-corrected partnership means, because they're considered separate stages in childhood, but they're too hard to distinguish in adulthood. So now you've got that kind of mental representation established, and you're really relying on it. When you're not with your partner, you are kind of able to hold them in your mind, and they're still bringing you comfort. You can still get that kind of safe haven and distress relief even when you're not in front of them. So maybe something stressful happens in your day and you just think, oh, I'm going to have to talk to my partner about that tonight. And just thinking about that or thinking about what they will say can help you calm down. Infatuation is over now, and so there's less passion and more security and calm. And people have more of a couples in this phase have more of a synchrony for their affect and their physiology. And this is a little hard to explain, but the way I understand it, they basically, can talk. Researchers will have them talk about something that they've experienced together, and they will report similar emotions about it. And if we measure their physiology, they might have similar changes in their heart rate or their cortisol. So I don't know if you've been around, or you are one, or you've been around more established couples. Just even listening to them tell a story, sometimes they can be different, but sometimes they're telling a story in a similar way. They're in agreement about it. So I'm just thinking back to when my husband and I did an addition, we would get these notifications that our costs were going to go up. And I think we both had the similar responses to that. And I'm partly worried just for the cost, but I'm partly worried because I know it stresses my husband out, And so we have this kind of empathy and history with one another that leads to this synchrony. We have now well-established separation distress. And obviously if our partners were to die, that would create a lot of, pain for us. And I think we see this to some extent at all stages, but obviously gets more established. And then serious commitment generally if we're planning on being monogamous. So you might pause and reflect, how you see these phases showing up for you or for others that you know. Okay, test yourself here. In what phase of attachment formation does infatuation occur? And this answer is pre-attachment. All right, let's start talking about online dating. Of course, you're likely to be thinking about your own experience with dating apps as we go through this material. So online dating started off as this stigmatized thing that was basically middle-aged divorced adults. And now it is so different than that. It's become a really common way to meet people, especially as we're going to see for younger populations. Now what we would say is 3 out of 10 of all American adults have used online dating at some point. And that includes people like me who've been married for decades, right? So if we just looked at people who are dating who are using online apps, that would be much higher. We can see that dating apps are used by all demographic groups, right? Men, women, all racial and ethnic backgrounds, or at least the ones represented here, all ages, especially emerging adults, which have really seen a dramatic increase in the last decade. All kind of socioeconomic backgrounds, both rural and suburban and urban. And then of note, online dating has always been higher among lesbian, gay, bisexual populations. perhaps because it's a smaller dating pool, or we've got this presumption of heterosexuality, so it's always sometimes hard to know if someone's gay or straight or kind of the right fit for you. So if we wonder, like, how successful is online dating? Of the people who are together now, partnered, how many of them met online? You can see that for emerging adults, it's about 20%, which is double the rate of all partnered adults. And also looking at kind of that doubling, lesbian, gay, bisexual adults, 25% are likely to have met online compared to just 9% of straight adults. So much higher use and success for lesbian, gay, bisexual adults. You can ponder what you think your answer would be to this question. So this was Pew Research from 2019, so a little bit older now, but when asking how successful people are likely to be in their relationship if they've met online, you can see that over half of Americans think that they would be just as successful. A few think they'd be more successful, and maybe a little over a third think they would be less successful. In terms of some gender differences, men are more likely than women to initiate contact on dating apps. However, women are more likely, once contact has been initiated, to do more to carry on the interaction. Men receive fewer replies in messages in general and are more likely to feel insecure about the lack of messages that they're getting. Women are twice as likely to feel overwhelmed with the number of messages that they're receiving, and also to receive unwanted or negative kind of responses. So that might be continued contact once they've said they're not interested, or an unwanted sexually explicit image, being called an offensive name, a small percentage physical threats of harm. So matching sites obviously help you find someone who might be a good fit for your personality and interests, makes it a kind of a safe way to communicate through technology. But some of the challenges are that, of course, people just put some limited information and generally positive things about themselves up on a dating app. And we also know that a number of choices can sometimes be overwhelming. And we can see that sometimes people feel like there's just too many choices. And so if you've ever heard that famous kind of jam study that was getting at, it's part of the choice architecture research and how people can have choice overload. The jam study was basically people showed up at a grocery store, and when they walked in, they could either sample 6 jams or 20 jams, and they were given a $1 off coupon. And then researchers looked to see who was more likely to buy one of these jams, someone who sampled 6 or someone who sampled 20. And it was the people who sampled 6 who were more likely to use their $1 off coupon, because the people who sampled 20 got overwhelmed and couldn't pick. And so we could imagine that might translate to sometimes online where it's just like, there's too many, I can't deal with this. We talked about the importance of olfactory cues in mate selection. And so one of the challenges with online is you can't smell them, right? They might look like a perfect fit, but when you get closer to them, they might not kind of genetically be a good fit for you. And then, like we've been alluding to with the gender differences information, there are, of course, safety issues, which we'll talk more about on the next slide. So again, talking more about safety issues, particularly for women, you can see here that women are at least twice as likely to have experienced each of these things. Receiving a sexually explicit message or image, being continued to be contacted even if they said they weren't interested, being called an offensive name, or being threatened. And you can see there that 2/3 of women under the age of 50 who have used dating sites have experienced at least one of these. So you might pause and consider if you see more pros or cons, or if you are thinking of other pros or cons that I didn't talk about. We're now just going to spend a few slides talking about the research on sexuality and attachment styles. Okay, so in our bodies, we have these two hardwired systems, our sexual system and our attachment system. And both of these are on a continuum. Like our sexual system, we could be shutting it down, or we could be really kicking it into gear. Our attachment systems, similarly, like we've talked about in the attachment couples and attachment lecture, we can tend to be hyperactivating our attachment needs, which is more associated with the anxious attachment style, or we can be deactivating or minimizing our attachment needs, which is more associated with the avoidant attachment style, or of course anywhere in between. And most of the work done says that these systems seem to, regarding sexual orientation, they seem to operate similarly for gay and straight individuals. And our positions on these continua aren't correlated, and they tend to interact in complex ways. So, for example, someone might tend to minimize their attachment needs or deactivate, but still pursue or hyperactivate for sex. But they may be going for kind of emotionally less intense or less vulnerable sex because that feels safer. Okay, so on this slide, we're talking about attachment insecurity in general, including both anxious and avoidant attachment styles. And the next slides will kind of break these apart. But in general, having higher amounts of anxiety and avoidance is correlated with, less positive and more negative feelings during sex, more anxiety about sex, even if someone who's avoidant isn't really conscious of expressing that. Less sexual arousal, orgasm, lower self-esteem around sex, less likely to talk about sexual needs and have safe sex, more substance use before sex, and then more at risk for being sexually coerced, particularly women, although it could go, it could be the reverse, and more likely to be sexually coercive, particularly men. What the research kind of says is that anxious women can be coerced to please their partner because they've got maybe this fear of rejection. Avoidant women might be more coerced because they want to avoid conflict with their partner. Anxious men men with an anxious attachment style, I should say, can pressure for sex to gain reassurance, and men with an avoidant attachment style can use sex for self-affirmation. So let's talk more about what the research says more specifically for the more avoidant attachment style and sexuality. So people, like we've mentioned, maybe who have higher avoidance on attachment, may be avoiding kind of more committed or sex with more emotional involvement. Thus, they might be using higher rates of masturbation, as a sexual outlet because it's less complicated. Expressing more positive attitudes towards casual sex and hookups, more likely to have, hookups or one-night stands, potentially more risk for having affairs, but that can also be for people with anxious attachment styles too. People who have a more avoidant attachment style are less likely to be using sex to get close to someone, more likely using it to feel good about themselves, essentially, or to basically have stress relief, which I think is a valid reason to have sex. So more likely to detach sex from love. So the relationship between attachment-related anxiety, the anxious attachment style, and sexual activity is a little less clear. Some research has found that for young males, it can translate into less sexual activity, and for young females, it can translate into more. And this is based, the hypothesized reason is that if more surveyed individuals are heterosexual, perhaps this is kind of skewing the data in this way that anxious young males might be deferring more to a female partner and thus not having as much sex. And anxious young females might be deferring more to a male partner and having more sex. But again, I think that that relationship might continue to change. There's some evidence that people with more anxious attachment styles see casual sex as more destructive, but others have evidence that women who are more anxious see casual sex as more positive. But attachment-related anxiety is associated with a more ambivalent attitude towards sex, maybe having a harder time relaxing, fears that you're sexually attractive, yet an intense kind of desire for closeness. And so this can put people with anxious attachment styles more at risk for unsafe sex, or like we've talked about, for sexual coercion, and having sex to please a well, it's not the same thing, or having sex to please a partner, and being more likely to equate sex and love. So we can imagine the potential mismatch if you've got someone with higher attachment related anxiety who's thinking sex equals love, partnering with someone or hooking up with someone with higher attachment related avoidance who does not think they're related at all. Okay, test yourself on this. And this is actually a tough question because you'd think it would just be anxious, but it's actually both. Because remember, even people who are avoidant can have anxiety that they're not really aware of or expressing sometimes about things. All right, now we're moving on to casual sex or hooking up. Okay, so some of the data on this slide, even though published in a more recent article, was from a number of years ago. But I haven't yet found another large-scale study this big from the most recent years. So what you can see is that about 3/4 of at least heterosexual college students reported at least one hookup by sometime during college. First hookups, you can see there less than a third involve intercourse, less than a third involve oral sex or genital stimulation. About 43% are non-genital contact for the first hookups. And as you're aware of course, hookups can become committed relationships, and sometimes exes are more likely to be a source of a hookup. Most hookups are with friends or acquaintances rather than strangers. So Armstrong and her colleagues really suggest that there's this sexual double standard, that says it's fine if men have casual sex, but women, if they have casual sex, aren't perceived as positively, and that this is somehow leading to an orgasm gap where men feel more entitled to have orgasm because casual sex is good for them, as no stigma there, whereas women maybe feel less entitled to have an orgasm because they're somehow bad, right, if they're having casual sex. So this orgasm gap, and this is among heterosexual couples, is the largest in first hookups. When you can see there, women only orgasming about a third of the time, 30% as often as men do. That gap gets narrower in repeat hookups and is at the smallest in relationships where women orgasm almost as 80% as much as men. Armstrong and colleagues really kind of suggest that there's kind of these two different rules. Men don't feel like they have to be generous to women in heterosexual hookups, but they do. It's often maybe more of a point of pride for generosity and placing her pleasure at a premium in relationships. And so you can kind of be pondering how much you agree or disagree with that. Okay, so let's remember that the majority of people, 75%, 3/4 of seniors, have hooked up sometime in college. So there's not always huge predictors, but some of the things that are correlated. Hooking up people are more likely to report a hookup if alcohol was involved. And alcohol use has mixed results in studies. Some people report that alcohol use is associated with more negative feelings about the hookup, and others have reported that alcohol use is associated with more positive feelings about the hookup. If you have positive attitudes towards hooking up, you're more likely to do it. That makes sense. If you're more extroverted, that makes sense as well. You might be more social. And then insecure attachment. And remember, the motives can be different. If you're more avoidant, then you might be having sex more for kind of letting off steam or feeling good about yourself. And if you're more anxious, then you might be hooking up for trying to win kind of partner approval, hopes of closeness, maybe even hopes of a relationship. Okay, so I find Campler's research really fascinating. So what Campler did is they summarized the literature on heterosexual hookups and then focused their research on queer college students. And so what Campler suggests is that there's this heterosexual hookup script, which doesn't exactly apply to queer hookups. Campler says that the heterosexual hookup script is that it has to be a meaningless interaction, that you can't be trying for, closeness or anything big with that. That there has to be ambiguity about what you're doing. No one's really like putting language to it about kind of what exactly it is that we're doing, and that alcohol has to be involved. And then in their interviews with queer college students, Campler explored this and found that, queer college students are likely to be talking about in their hookups, do we want to take it to the next level? So it doesn't have to be this meaningless interaction that can't, become a relationship or move towards a relationship. That there can be clear communication about what it is exactly that we're doing sexually and what do you want to do. And that alcohol isn't necessarily a central part of queer hookups. In fact, one of Campler's interviewees kind of implied that alcohol in hookup is like a straight thing. And so, I am wondering what you think about this, how much you agree or disagree. In some ways, as much as I find this really interesting and I think there's some truth to it, I also wonder when we think about kind of beta bias and alpha bias, beta bias is minimizing differences between groups and alpha bias is exaggerating. I wonder if there is a little bit of an exaggeration of difference here, only because some other research suggests that, heterosexual college students are still looking for relationships. Campler suggests that heterosexual college students are hooking up because they don't want to have a serious relationship because that's going to interfere with their life course goals around education and career. But we actually see that a lot of college students do have relationships of 6 months or more. And other research suggests that heterosexual women and men are hooking up in hopes of getting a committed relationship. Not all, but some. So you might be thinking about kind of what you agree with, what feels kind of true and relevant, and anything that you disagree with. Okay, this is an older study now, but I still think it's pretty interesting, and so I'll share it. It was involving about 1,500 college students, and the data, it was reported in 2015, and it's just exploring the varying reactions that college students can have to hookups. And so they were surveyed about a hookup that they'd had within the last 12 months. So it wasn't like, immediately after a hookup. And what the researchers found is that about 60% reported mostly positive feelings, that they felt happy or desirable or adventuresome. The people who were reporting more of these positive feelings also, and this wasn't causal, it was just correlational, also reported that in general they were less depressed and less lonely. They had better connection to their peers. Interestingly, they reported more intensive genital contact and higher intoxication. I don't think that means that in order to have a good experience, you should get drunk and really go for it, but that is a little bit what this data is suggesting. And that the 40% who had more negative reactions used words like awkward, disappointed, empty, used. Also, this wasn't correlational. It wasn't causal. Again, it was just correlational. They also, at this time in their life, were reporting more depression and loneliness and lower social connection. And so, in my mind, one of the takeaways is that if you're feeling lonely and depressed, hooking up probably isn't going to help you feel better. But if you're feeling pretty good about yourself, then hooking up, might be fun. Okay, sometimes we have a debate question on this one. Is casual sex harmful? And of course, what the research is going to tell you is there's evidence for yes, there's evidence for no, and there's a lot of factors that it depends upon. So you might be thinking, like, what are the things that it depends upon? Okay, and then you might think of gender specifically. Is casual sex more beneficial or less harmful for men than for women? And again, kind of what are the pros and cons for maybe each for men and for women. Okay, so now let's move on to talking about pornography specifically as related to relationship quality. So earlier large-scale research on this topic kind of presumed heterosexuality. More large-scale research that I've reviewed is just sampling large groups, and it isn't really distinguishing on sexual orientation. So I think for the most part, this applies to all sexual orientations, but I'll tell you times that I think it only applies to heterosexuals. So pornography use has been rising for sure during recent years across a lot of demographic groups, so for teens, for adults, for both men and women. It's particularly more normative and rising for those who are non-religious and more associated with kind of Western cultures. It's rising both for individual use and for couple, which is often called joint use. Overall, the decades of research on pornography show a higher a negative correlation between pornography and a number of relationship factors, which we're going to talk about. Also, maybe for psychological distress too. This is mainly at higher male individual viewing levels. So not as much for joint couple, not as much for women, and not as much for lower use, right? That we're going to see these effects. And still, these effects are small. And with the rise, with more people viewing pornography, those effect sizes are probably getting even smaller. Okay, so some of the research on pornography and romantic relationships finds that it kind of depends on how you're using it, which makes sense. The use that is kind of more ideal or, less harmful for couple outcomes is viewing erotica or nonviolent pornography that the couple views together, so joint use. Still, though, at least for heterosexual couples, these couples have a higher correlation of infidelity than non-pornography users, but they also don't report a lot of differences in relationship quality compared to non-pornography users. Use that seems to be more harmful for couple outcomes, like relationship quality and stability, is pornography that's more violent or degrading. Often that's towards women, and individual secret use, often maybe more male use that's being hidden, for example, from a female partner. Okay, so many couples indicate no effects of the use of pornography on their relationship, but when we think about benefits, there are some that have been described in the research literature. I think these are less well researched than the harmful effects, but some of the things that people say is it helps them be more open-minded, more attentive to their partner. It gives them maybe some kind of sex education, right, about techniques, increases their sexual arousal and desire. If they're using it individually, gives them kind of a sexual outlet or release, and again, might increase the sexual variety that they're doing in their relationship. So this research on this slide is more focused on heterosexual couples. I can't confirm that these findings are the same for lesbian, gay, bisexual couples. And so in terms of more documented quantitative harmful effects, there's both correlational research and causal research. So correlational studies just show that higher rates of pornography viewing is correlated with higher risk of infidelity or having an affair and more acceptance of the possibility of an affair, of lower commitment to a partner. And again, that might just be because it's there's that greater sense of other possibilities or alternatives, and more correlated with divorce. The causal studies, how those often work is that they'll randomly assign someone to view pornography, say for 6 weeks, and this is often males that they're randomly assigning to view porn. And what they found is that, if you're randomly assigned to view it or not, those often males who have been randomly assigned to view porn for 6 weeks will report less satisfaction afterwards for their partner's attractiveness, their satisfaction with their partner's affection, with sexual curiosity and performance. And they are also reporting kind of more like flirting, kissing, potentially cheating behaviors outside of their relationship. And then it's also, been documented that, of course, partners show higher rates of distress if someone's using pornography in a more secretive way. Qualitative studies, research studies using interview data also report some harmful effects around people reporting that use of porn can give them a sense of inadequacy as a sexual partner or create some unrealistic expectations. Okay, so here's a bit more on the harmful effects for heterosexual couples, and specifically the research on the harmful effects for heterosexual males. So again, this has been laboratory studies where they're randomly assigning, heterosexual males to either be viewing nothing, maybe nothing, or nonviolent pornography or pornography that's more violent and degrading to women. And then they're kind of testing to see how they respond. And so they might If, for example, after viewing more degrading pornography, if they're presented with a female research confederate, and then they're asked to kind of make some guesses about her or her characteristics, they might focus more on her physical characteristics than maybe what they gleaned from interacting with her about her intellectual, attributes. Also, both nonviolent and violent pornography have been causally linked with very short-term but small increases in male aggressive behavior. Maybe after watching the porn, they're given a scenario and asked how they would respond, and they're more likely to show aggression. So that just kind of says in a greater state of arousal, you might have a more aggressive response, in the short term. But again, that's small. And that violent or degrading pornography, it's a lot of people can watch it and it isn't going to affect them. But if the male is already at risk for aggressive behavior, then there's a slight increase in the risk of sexual coercion or assault following the use of the violent or degrading pornography. All right, so you can be thinking about your answer to this question. Do you think pornography can work in a committed relationship if only one person is using it? And what might be the factors? All right, it was another long one with a lot of material, and you made it to the end. Good job.